They say that certain records from the winter of 1884 carry a silence that even time has been unable to decipher. And before this account is fully revealed, the researcher responsible for organizing it leaves only a brief note, almost a whisper. Comment on which city you are watching from and what time it is there now. Sometimes, such simple details help us understand how old stories continue to cross borders. In the Ashbrook County archives, there is a set of yellowed documents, fragile pages that crumble at the edges, recounting not only the landscape of a small rural community, but also the enigma that forever marked the local memory. The disappearance of 27 horsemen who entered the winter cellar of the Widow of Ashbrook and were never seen again. The story, retold several times in newspapers, community records, and individual accounts, refers to the woman only as the widow. No name, no detailed origin, no recorded ties prior to her arrival in the valley. She appeared in the summer of 1879, bought a small piece of land at the foot of a hillside, and since then has lived alone in her wooden house, built partly on an ancient stone foundation. The geography of the region in 1884 was marked by rolling hills, wide swaths of dry fields in winter, and narrow trails winding through sturdy trees. The wind blowing from the north brought fine particles of ice that accumulated in the cracks of the windows, and many travelers described Ashbrook as a place where winter began too early and ended too late. The community, made up of farmers, small traders, and families who had lived there for more than 3 generations, was well aware of the harshness of the climate. The widow's presence, however, seemed out of place in this setting. She was too discreet, too quiet, and maintained a routine that few could describe accurately. Some distant neighbors claimed that she would leave at dawn with an iron basket, always walking eastward, where there were old stone quarries abandoned since before the Civil War. Others said they had never seen her at the local market and that she bought groceries only through orders delivered by messengers who rarely got to see her face. What is known with more certainty is that the widow took care of the root crops herself, maintained a small vegetable garden even in the cold months, and used the large underground cellar of the house as a storage area for the winter, a space built long before she arrived. This basement, mentioned in almost all official reports, had an unusual structure for rural properties of that period. It was accessed through a reinforced wooden door built into the west side of the house, and the steps were made of irregular stone, apparently reused from old buildings. Inside, according to the county clerk who visited it in August 1882, the space held dozens of shelves, toolboxes, supplies wrapped in thick fabric, and a rudimentary ventilation system that no one could quite explain. It was not common nor necessary for a person to live alone, but nothing in the widow's life seemed to follow any pattern of normality for that time. The Ashbrook community lived with these peculiarities with a certain indifference, not least because the widow had never caused any trouble. She was reserved but polite to those who approached her. She paid her taxes on time, kept her property clean, and according to 3 preserved testimonies, always offered fresh water to weary travelers who knocked on her door asking for temporary shelter from the cold. Nothing in those records suggested that she posed a danger or fueled any kind of conflict. Still, there was one recurring detail in the residents' notes: the light. For many winters, several neighbors claimed to have seen a lamp lit in the basement late at night. Not a strong, flickering light, but a small, static glow, as if someone were sitting there for hours, motionless. Some thought she was doing repairs, others believed it was just her habit of checking winter supplies. But this constant glow, repeated year after year, made the house a striking presence in the silent landscape of the season. The winter of 1884, however, began earlier and more severely than any other. Weather records from the time describe a period of continuous frost, biting winds, and frozen trails that made it difficult for any horse to travel. It was in this extreme setting that a group of horsemen, 27 men in all from different parts of the county, began to gather frequently on the route near the widow's property. There are discrepancies about why they were there. Some documents suggest they were seeking temporary refuge from a snowstorm, Others mention the investigation of an incident that occurred in the northern mountains days earlier. There is no consensus, only fragments. What does exist, however, is a report by the local marshal, written days after the disappearance, mentioning unusual behavior observed at the widow's residence on the eve of the event. The note is short, barely legible, and ends abruptly, as if the author had been interrupted, but it contains a sentence that stands out in darker ink. There was something at the basement door, something that wasn't there before. And this is precisely where the archives begin to enter the realm of gaps, the fertile ground of mystery. The months leading up to the winter of 1884 in Ashbrook appear in the records as a period of apparent normality. But when looked at closely, small details suggest that something was gradually shifting out of its familiar axis. This researcher's work has been precisely that, piecing together routines, stray phrases in late testimonies, marginalized notes in personal notebooks, to try to reconstruct what life was like for the Widow of Ashbrook before the disappearance of the 27 horsemen. The oldest versions of the accounts describe the widow as a discreet figure, with restrained movements, always wearing dark dresses and a scarf tied to her hair, even indoors. A merchant named Elias Turner, who ran a small store in town, recorded in his account book 3 deliveries made to her property between September and November of that year. In each of the entries, there is a different observation. In the first, he writes that the woman spoke little, but paid for everything in carefully separated coins. In the second, he mentions that she asked for more coarse salt than usual for a single person. In the third, he draws attention to something that only made sense years later, when rereading the notebook. She asked very calmly if the horsemen from the north still passed through Ashbrook Road on Sundays. This type of comment, taken in isolation, could be mere curiosity. But when other documents are added, it becomes clear that the widow was somehow observing who passed by and how often. 2 young farmers, brothers, stated in testimonies taken decades later that when they crossed the road in the early hours of late autumn, they always saw boot prints and recent horseshoe marks near the fence of her property, marks that did not match the typical lack of movement on that stretch of road. The widow's daily life, as reconstructed, was simple and repetitive. She woke up early, before the first light, lit the wood stove, and according to a close neighbor, let the smell of baking bread fill the dirt path that connected her house to the main road. Sometimes, an almost bluish smoke came out of the small chimney, a discreet contrast against the pale winter sky. Then she did what many in the region did. She checked fences, gathered firewood, and made sure the water barrels hadn't frozen overnight. But there were differences. While other families lived in crowded houses with children running around and voices crossing through the rooms, the widow's house remained silent. There was no laughter, no arguments, no songs at the end of the afternoon. Just the occasional scraping of a chair, the slamming of an interior door, the distant sound of a wooden lid being lifted and closed, a sound that neighbors, without seeing inside, learned to associate with the winter cellar. The basement was the center of her routine. Everyone knew that. One of the few official records about the building is a structural inspection report made when the property changed hands years later. In it, the appraiser describes the basement as deeper than necessary, cold as a well, and organized with almost military precision. The shelves had labels, the bags were lined up by food type, and old tools shared space with objects that no one could identify with precision. Nothing, however, pointed to anything criminal or openly suspicious. It was just overly prepared. The widow's relationship with the community remained in a delicate balance between distance and convenience. She did not attend church on Sundays, a fact that some residents never forgave, but she contributed small amounts to the building's maintenance funds, sent in anonymous envelopes, although everyone knew who they came from. She did not participate in community dinners, but occasionally left baskets of vegetables at the doorsteps of families who had lost crops to frost. She was at once both present and absent. The challenges of the time are also well documented. 1884 was a tough year for Ashbrook. A plague struck part of the corn crops. There were reports of sick cattle, and the price of some groceries rose sharply. Amid these problems, rumors circulated about petty thefts on more remote farms. Tools disappeared, bags of grain vanished overnight, and trails showed signs of recent passage by groups on horseback. Some attributed these actions to outlaws from neighboring counties, others to men desperate from hunger. In more than one testimony, however, an enigmatic reference appears. They said that those who needed shelter in the far west of the valley always ended up, one way or another, near the widow's house. The horsemen who would eventually disappear appear in the records little by little, like shadows slowly approaching the center of the narrative. A notebook belonging to the marshal himself mentions in passing a group of men who traveled between Ashbrook and the more mountainous areas to the north, offering escort services, transportation, and, eventually, armed protection for shipments of dubious value. Their names appear in a fragmented form, some completely illegible, others repeated on different temporary detention lists. There is no indication that they were heroes, nor clearly defined villains. They were, like many at that time, men trying to survive on the margins of the law and the needs of the countryside. A middle-aged farmer, who years later gave a detailed account of the days leading up to the disappearance, claimed to have seen part of this group pass twice in front of the widow's property, in consecutive weeks, always in the late afternoon. The first time, according to him, two of the horsemen looked longingly at the house, as if looking for some specific sign. The second time, one of them even dismounted from his horse and approached the wooden fence, where he remained for a few minutes looking at the west side of the house, the side where the basement entrance was located. There is also a particularly revealing statement given by a woman who was a child at the time and lived on a neighboring property. She says that one morning, while fetching water, she saw the widow standing in the yard with her back to the road, holding an empty bucket. The detail that struck her, and which remained in her memory until old age, was the woman's posture, upright, motionless, as if she were listening to something that others could not hear. She didn't seem scared, the testimony says. She seemed to be waiting. When the widow realized she was being watched, she turned, nodded briefly, and went back into the house without saying a word. These small fragments form a backdrop that, in a way, makes the disappearance of the 27 horsemen less abrupt and more unsettling. It was not a sudden event released into the void, but the outcome of a sequence of silent approaches, prolonged glances toward the winter barn, seemingly innocent questions about trails and schedules. The last days before the disappearance, reconstructed from different sources, show an increase in movement on the roads surrounding Ashbrook. Groups of men on horseback were spotted at unusual times, and the sound of horseshoes echoing on the hardened ice of dawn was mentioned in more than one account. A mailman claimed to have seen, in the distance, men standing on the trail, as if discussing a route or observing something beyond his view. A teacher, returning home after teaching in town, said he heard muffled laughter and tense voices near the widow's property on a night when the sky was completely clear and the wind was almost non-existent. During this same period, according to Elias Turner's account book, the widow placed one last order, recorded without any additional comments: extra lamps and more oil than ever before. What caught the merchant's attention was the fact that she asked for the delivery to be made not at the main door, but near the side entrance close to the basement. He wrote down the order, made the delivery, and never saw the widow again. When this information is pieced together, the widow's attention to the horsemen's routes, their interest in the house, the increased traffic on the trails, the stocking up of oil lamps and oil in the basement, the feeling is that something was quietly being prepared. There is no evidence of a plan, nor are there any documents pointing to an explicit agreement between the widow and those men. What exists are clues, repeated coincidences that, decades later, still disturb those who pore over the papers. On the last afternoon before the disappearance, one of the few reliable visual accounts describes the widow's property in an almost cinematic way. The house silhouetted against a gray sky, thin smoke rising from the chimney, and, on the west side, a small change in the landscape. Something different in the area of the basement door. The witness could not say whether it was a new mark in the wood, an object leaning against it, or a change in the way the entrance seemed to fit into the stone wall. He only remembers slowing his pace, feeling an indefinable discomfort, and moving on, not daring to approach. Hours later, according to the marshal's report, the first horseman was seen riding down the road toward the Ashbrook widow's house. And from that point on, none of the 27 would ever be seen passing through there again. The night of their disappearance, December 17, 1884, is one of the most described in the archives, although no account can reconstruct it completely. What exists is a mosaic of fragments, testimonies collected years later, incomplete notes from the marshal, private letters preserved by local families, and a sequence of small details that, together, create the impression of a heavy, dense night, laden with foreboding. It is as if the entire Ashbrook Valley on that early morning was waiting for something it could not name. The temperature dropped abruptly in the late afternoon. The wind coming down from the hills was laden with fine, sharp ice and brought with it an unusual silence, as if every sound were immediately swallowed up by the frozen air. Weather records indicate that the wind chill reached levels rarely documented in the region in that century. The ground hardened, and the sound of each horseshoe striking the frozen earth echoed farther than usual. Around 6 p.m., a farmer named Isaac Mulberry saw the first group of horsemen coming down the main trail leading to the widow's property. He described the scene as a dark, moving cut. Men wrapped in heavy blankets, hats pulled down against the wind, restless horses snorting white clouds. They seemed determined, and there was no hesitation as they approached the west fence. None of them looked at the neighboring houses, as if they knew exactly where they were going. Shortly thereafter, according to another witness, a second group arrived, and throughout the night, the 27 men gathered in front of the house, some coming from more distant trails, others descending from less traveled routes. There is no record of conversations, only of the silent, rhythmic movement that marked their arrival. The only visible light came from inside the widow's house, a dim, flickering lamp whose glow cast an irregular rectangle on the snow. The county marshal, in his longest note, mentions that before leaving for the scene, he had heard 2 contradictory reports about the widow's presence that night. One person said they had seen her at the front door, watching the men's movements. Another insisted that the woman was not at home, that the lamp, as so often, had been left burning in the basement, and that no one had crossed the front door since early afternoon. There is no consensus. The only thing that is confirmed is that when the marshal reached the highest point of the road, it was already too late. All the horsemen had disappeared inside the property. What is known for certain is that the men did not break into the house. There are no marks of force on the wood, nor any signs of confrontation, according to the notes preserved in the subsequent report. Most disturbing is the trail record. The horses were left outside, still saddled, tied to trees and stakes. Some animals were agitated, others seemed strangely quiet. The snow around them was marked by deep tracks, boots, horseshoes, circular impressions of objects that no one could identify with certainty. The basement door, mentioned so often in the reports, appears again as a focal point. Witnesses who saw the house before the marshal's arrival report that the door was ajar, something rare, almost unheard of for that time of year. A lit lamp partially illuminated the stone steps, casting long shadows that mingled with the wind and steam rising from the frozen ground. No one could say whether the men were lured there or went of their own accord. What can be said, based on the marks on the ground, is that all 27 entered the basement at some point that night. One of the most detailed accounts, found decades later among the belongings of a former assistant to the marshal, describes the sound heard in the distance by 3 neighbors who lived in the hills above the property. Steady footsteps descending the stone staircase, then a pause of silence, followed by a hollow metallic noise as if something heavy had been moved. The sound, repeated 2 or 3 times, suddenly ceased, leaving the valley plunged into silence. At 9 p.m., and according to rough calculations based on the positions mentioned by witnesses, the last group of horsemen entered the property. The wood of the basement door appears to have been touched by several of them. There were finger marks, scraped ice, and wear marks that had not been there before. None of this, however, indicates violence. On the contrary, the arrangement of the marks suggests order, an organized, almost disciplined entry. There are no reports of shouting, arguments, horses galloping, or any sign of turmoil. When the marshal finally arrived at the scene, he found only the horses tied up and the basement door completely dark. The lamp was no longer lit. In his notes, he describes the cold he felt as he approached the entrance. "Not the cold of the night," he writes, "but a cold coming from within, as if the underground air had long been untouched by human breath." The man hesitated before descending the steps, and his description of the interior of the basement is brief, almost frustrating in its lack of detail. He mentions shelves, boxes, tools, supplies, all perfectly organized. No sign of a struggle, no objects out of place. The only thing that caught his attention was the floor. In the deepest part of the basement, there was an area where the dust seemed to have been recently removed, as if something large had been dragged or moved from there. There were no clear marks, just the absence of them. The marshal ran his hand over the cold stone and noticed that the spot was still slightly damp, as if snow had melted there minutes before. He climbed back up, breathing heavily, and wrote down what would become his most quoted phrase in the decades to come. "There is nothing here, and yet everything indicates that they were here." The initial investigation was confusing. Lanterns were lit, neighbors gathered, and the sound of restless horses broke the heavy silence. Some men eventually went down to the basement, but found nothing beyond what the marshal had described. The strangest thing, and this appears in two independent accounts, was the impression that the air inside the basement was warmer than outside. Not warm enough to be comfortable, but warm in a wrong way, as if there had been a very recent source of heat that had disappeared without a trace. Outside, the snow was beginning to fall again, fine and delicate, slowly covering the horses' hooves and erasing the marks on the road. The marshal asked everyone to wait outside while he took one last look inside the house. The front door was closed. He knocked 3 times. No answer. Upon entering, he described a simple, clean, organized environment, and completely empty. There was no sign of recent activity in the kitchen. The dishes were put away, the pots clean and cold. There was no hot water on the stove, no burning embers. A chair was pulled away from the table, but it was unclear whether it had been moved hours or days earlier. The widow's bedroom was tidy, the bed made, the curtains closed. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that indicated haste, fear, or escape. It was in the main room that the marshal found the only concrete trace of that night. A piece of dark fabric, folded on the table, partially covered by a thin remnant of freshly melted snow. He describes the fabric as coarse, thick, typical of blankets used by horsemen. The edge was torn, as if it had been held tightly. There was no blood, no mud, no other clues. Just the fabric, alone, silent, out of place. This fragment would be catalogued as evidence number 4, and although it seems insignificant, it is precisely around it that the most persistent theories would arise years later. But at that moment, faced with the emptiness of the house and the basement, the county men could only ask one question. Where had the 27 horsemen gone? The marshal left the house around 11 p.m. He noted that as he closed the door, he noticed something on the ground, partially covered by the freshly fallen snow. He bent down to take a closer look, wiped the surface with the back of his hand, and froze. On the basement doorstep, someone had carved a simple symbol with the tip of a boot, or perhaps some other pointed object. 2 parallel lines, and a short line crossing them diagonally. It was not a symbol known in the region, nor was it associated with any traveling groups. It was just a mark, but it looked recent, very recent, and according to the marshal, that mark was not there when he arrived. It was the last confirmed record of that night. After that, snow covered the basement entrance, erased all clues, and plunged Ashbrook into a silence that would last for decades. The morning after the disappearance of the 27 horsemen is described in the archives as one of the most tense in Ashbrook's history. Snow had fallen all night, covering trails, erasing tracks, leveling the ground until it became a white, smooth, silent surface. The few marks that remained were the deep prints left by the horses, animals that now shivered with cold, still tied up, as if waiting for their owners. It was an uncomfortable silence for a place accustomed to the harshness of winter. The first residents to arrive at the property brought with them a mixture of fear and curiosity. Some came to help, others to understand. The news had spread quickly, accompanied by contradictory rumors. Some said that the widow had been seen entering the basement with the men. Others claimed that the house was completely empty when they arrived. The lack of clarity fueled suspicion, and suspicion in a small place quickly turns into accusations. One of the immediate consequences was the search for the widow. As she was the only person residing on the property, she inevitably became the center of all speculation. The community wanted answers, and she was missing. There were no signs of escape, no supplies taken, no belongings missing. Her shoes were still in the entryway, and her clothes were folded in the wardrobe as usual. Whatever had happened that night, there was no sign that the widow had planned to leave the house. Some residents believed she had played an active role in the disappearance of the horseman. Others argued that she herself might be among the missing, perhaps involved in a silent confrontation that had escaped the eyes of the first witnesses. There was no shortage of theories, only facts. And, as the marshal noted in his first meeting with the local council, nothing is worse for an investigation than too much silence and too much imagination. The official search began at dawn. Experienced men were sent to the trails surrounding Ashbrook. They looked for human footprints, wheel marks, signs of camping, any indication of movement. They found only snow. Its thickness varied depending on the terrain, thinner in open areas, almost impenetrable on slopes, but at no point were there any recent marks other than those made by the searchers themselves. The conclusion was discouraging. The disappearance must have been so sudden and so complete that it left no noticeable clues. On the property, the investigation progressed slowly. The basement was examined by 2 inspectors who confirmed the marshal's initial impression. No signs of a struggle, no recent displacement of objects, no structural anomalies. Still, something bothered everyone who descended the stone staircase. The smell. An almost imperceptible dry odor that did not resemble mold or damp wood. One of the inspectors described the smell as the residue of air that had been breathed heavily and then suddenly interrupted. Another said it smelled like the end of a fire that never existed. There was no consensus, only the feeling that this space held more than it showed. The piece of fabric found the night before became the focus of the analysis. Taken to the county warehouse, it was examined by a group of experienced merchants. They all agreed that it was material used by horsemen, but disagreed on its exact origin. One of them claimed to recognize the weave as typical of groups operating in the northern mountains. Another insisted that it was material often purchased by travelers who acted as escorts. The fabric itself was not incriminating, but it raised an uncomfortable question. Why was it on the widow's table? Even more disturbing was the symbol found on the basement doorstep. Older men were consulted, including a former carpenter who had lived his first 20 years in the neighboring county. None recognized the sign. It was not a craftsman's mark, nor that of a trade or religious group. The most accepted conclusion was that the symbol had been created by the horsemen themselves, although no one could say for what purpose. A mark to indicate a route, a warning, a record of passage. Interpretations varied as much as the discomfort at the lack of answers. As the days passed, rumors began to take shape. Some claimed that these men had debts with influential merchants and had chosen the widow's house as a meeting place before a planned escape. Others said that the widow kept objects of unknown value in her basement and that the group had entered there in search of something specific. There was also the hypothesis that an internal dispute between the horsemen had ended fatally and that they had all been buried somewhere remote in the valley. A hypothesis that was never substantiated, as no excavation found any traces. One of the most accepted theories, although also without evidence, came from an unexpected testimony. The account of a young messenger who, days before the disappearance, claimed to have left a heavy package at the side entrance of the property. The package, wrapped in thick cloth, had been ordered by the widow, but the messenger said that, at the time of delivery, he saw one of the horsemen coming out from behind the house. He said nothing, just nodded discreetly, as if he were there for a known reason. Years later, the witness admitted that the gesture had been so natural that he did not think to record the fact in his delivery log. This small revelation changed the community's perception. If one of the horsemen had been on the property before the night of the disappearance, then perhaps, just perhaps, there was some connection between them and the widow that the residents were unaware of. The marshal, however, remained cautious. In his correspondence with the county judge, he wrote a sentence that would become iconic among researchers of the case. In Ashbrook, the absence of evidence always competes with the excess of interpretations. Over time, and in the face of growing pressure to present conclusions, the investigation began to focus on the basement. The door, the stairs, the walls, the floor. Everything was examined several times. They hammered on suspicious bricks, tested the thickness of the stones, and checked for hidden chambers. They found nothing, except in one of the last inspections, a detail that would have gone unnoticed. A thin, irregular splinter of wood stuck in the lower corner of the door. The splinter did not match the wood of the house. It was darker, more resinous, with a distinct smell. When it was taken to the warehouse for comparison, a local merchant stated that this wood was used in shipping crates from the colder northern regions, crates that used to carry tools, ammunition, or surplus military supplies. This was the revelation that shook the narrative up to that point. If the horseman brought or handled boxes inside the property, then the widow's house may have been a point of unloading, storage, or trading. It was no longer just a place of accidental passage. It was potentially part of something bigger. But what had been taken into the basement that night? What had been removed? Where? And why? The wood splinter, catalogued as evidence number 12, did not lead to new answers. No boxes of that type were found in the area. No merchant admitted to having traded with the group. None of the horsemen's belongings were located. It was as if, upon entering the widow's basement, the men had left behind not only their horses, but also their stories, their ties, and their very documentary existence. After weeks of searching, the case was officially closed without conclusion. The widow, never found, became a mythical figure for the residents, sometimes seen as an accomplice, sometimes as a victim, sometimes as a symbol of the silence that hangs over certain events in history. The neighboring properties were sold, families moved away, and Ashbrook slowly resumed its routine. But one last note, written in faded ink at the bottom of the final report, continues to intrigue researchers to this day. On the 14th day after the disappearance, someone relit the lamp in the basement, and although the deep snow had erased all traces, a witness claimed to have seen a lone shadow moving inside the house that early morning, a shadow that no one could identify. Decades have passed since that December night in 1884, and what remains of the case of the 27 horsemen of Ashbrook is largely confined to fragile paper that time has not yet destroyed. What was once breaking news, heated rumor, palpable fear, has become faded columns in local newspapers, notes in the margins of personal notebooks, minutes from meetings of a council that no longer exists, and official reports stored in wooden boxes that almost no one opens anymore. Today, anyone who sits in front of these archives, in this quiet office, illuminated by a soft light falling on yellowed pages, finds fewer answers than questions. And yet, they continue reading. Not because they believe that so many years later they will be able to uncover what the winter of 1884 covered up, but because certain cases, no matter how old they are, seem to function as discrete mirrors. They reflect not only what happened, but how a community chose to remember, and above all, what it decided to forget. What is known objectively can be summed up in a few lines. In December 1884, 27 men arrived at the property of a woman known only as the Widow of Ashbrook. They left their horses outside, entered the house, and at some point that night went down to the winter cellar. They were never seen again. There is no record of the bodies. There are no official documents about any late confessions, nor any subsequent findings that indicate a clear fate. The basement has been examined countless times, The house has changed owners. The region has been transformed. The case was closed without conclusion. But the story does not actually end with the disappearance of these men. It extends in concentric circles, in the families who waited for news and never received it, in the children who grew up hearing different versions of the same night, in the fields that, for a time, seemed quieter than normal each time winter returned. Little by little, Ashbrook continued to live, as all communities are forced to do. Still, something of what happened there remained stored away, not only in archive boxes, but in a kind of shameful memory that no one likes to bring up, but that never completely disappears. In reconstructing this case, the researcher writing these lines encountered the same obstacle more than once: the gap between what people remember and what is actually written. Many testimonies collected decades later openly contradict each other. Some soften, others dramatize, some seem shaped by the need to find a belated culprit. Among all these versions, the figure of the widow always returns to occupy the center. She is, at the same time, the most present and least defined face in this archive. There is no photograph. There is no birth certificate. There is no marriage record. No surviving letters. No confirmed signature. Only indirect descriptions: dark dresses, quiet gait, difficult to sustain gaze, low but firm voice. The Widow of Ashbrook exists, for those who study her today, as an outline. Everything we know about her is filtered through the eyes of others, through the fears of others, through the expectations of others. It is possible that she was just a woman trying to survive in a valley that did not forgive weaknesses. It is possible that she was an accomplice to businesses that preferred the shadows to the minutes. It is possible that she participated, by action or omission, in something that ended in tragedy. And it is also possible that she was dragged into an event she could not have imagined. The archive does not allow for any definitive verdict. On the contrary, it resists any simple conclusion. The missing horsemen, in turn, were transformed over time into characters in a semi-official narrative told in kitchens, bars, and late afternoon gatherings. In some versions, they became almost martyrs, men who paid dearly for trusting the wrong person. In others, they were treated as outlaws who finally met the fate that their choices had foretold. When these accounts are cross-referenced with police records, debt records, and temporary work lists, a less clear-cut and more human image emerges. They were ordinary men with checkered pasts, trying to negotiate some advantage in the midst of a difficult winter. It is perhaps here that the most uncomfortable layer of this story is revealed. This is not just a mass disappearance. It is about how a community, and then a county, and then all those who, out of curiosity or obligation, touched this case, dealt with the fact that it is not always possible to establish innocence and guilt with the clarity we would like. In many documents, there is an almost desperate impulse to find an explanation that would restore some order to the world. This impulse, however, always hits the same wall: the lack of evidence. And then there are the details. The symbol marked on the basement step, the lamp relit on the 14th day, the splinter of wood that didn't match the house, the piece of fabric on the table, the horses left outside, as if waiting for a return that never happened. Each of these pieces, taken separately, does not say much. Together they suggest a convergence of intentions, fears, haste, and decisions that exploded silently on that winter night. Decades later, when the descendants of some of the families involved were interviewed, few wanted to talk at length about the case. Some avoided the subject, others reduced the story to a handful of dry sentences, almost memorized. It is as if, over time, the community had decided that the best way to live with the disappearance was to diminish it, until it fit into an anecdote, a brief comment, a reference that did not require a return to the archives. Even so, the basement remained there, renovated, emptied, reused. At some point, part of its structure was demolished, and the original stones were reused in other buildings. There is no longer a door with a symbol born of snow. There are no longer steps leading to that layer of air described as strangely warm. The physical place, at least in the form it had in 1884, ceased to exist. But the question remains: Not so much where did the 27 horsemen go, but rather, what does a story like this reveal about the limits of what we can know, even when we gather all the papers, all the testimonies, all the clues? Ultimately, this case speaks less about a specific night and more about how time, fear, guilt, and silence combine to erase certain footprints and preserve others. Today, when leafing through the documents, the researcher realizes that what binds him to this archive is not the hope of finding a hidden key among the pages. It is the awareness that stories like Ashbrook's remind us of something deeply human, our need to close narratives, to point a finger at someone, to turn ambiguity into certainty, and the discomfort we feel when none of this is possible. Perhaps Ashbrook's widow died far away, anonymous, in some other forgotten valley. Perhaps one of the horsemen survived, started a new life under another name, carrying with him memories he never dared to put into words. Perhaps none of them had this second act. The file does not answer. It only offers what it has: dates, incomplete names, fragmented descriptions, a succession of attempts to understand. In the end, these papers show less what happened, and more how much we can't bear not knowing. And perhaps that is why, every time someone finishes reading the case of the 27 horsemen and the Widow of Ashbrook, the instinctive gesture is the same: to close the file carefully, rest your hand on the folder, and remain in absolute silence for a few moments.